right?
My mother does that too.
Welcome.
Yeah.
We've started streaming maybe successfully, and I think Josh might be checking to see if we
verifying.
really are. I'm Kendall Robertson. I'm filling in for Tracy today. And the several times in the past I've tried to get streaming working, I have not been successful, but Josh helped me today. Great. All right, thanks for coming. Today we're starting a new book, Hosea, one of the minor prophets. Intriguing book to go into. And one of the first things that came to mind to me when I read this is one of my favorite demotivators.
I love demotivators.
Demotivators are one of my favorite things. So this is a company called Despair.com that basically makes fun of the motivational posters that people put around companies. And so this one says, mistakes. It could be that the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others.
Josh gets me a demotivator calendar every year for Christmas.
Yay! I have not actually bought their calendar, but I've seen a lot of their stuff that different people have had, and I've looked at everything they have. I've worked at a number of places that had the motivational things up that weren't this, and I always wanted to go switch out their posters without telling anybody, see if anybody would notice. Anyway, this is not a biblical picture, but it's really what popped in my mind when I read the beginning of Hosea.
That is a biblical picture. It shows us what not to do.
Don't sink your boat.
Yeah.
Let's look here. The thing I want to introduce here is illustrating God. And so, as Christians, it's our privilege that God has invited us to illustrate Him to the people around us. That we get to show God's love. If somebody's not feeling God's love, maybe it's because we're not showing them God's love. If somebody's not hearing God's word, maybe it's because we're not telling them God's word. It's really a privilege to be able to shine for God. One of the things that in my marriage I've always told Julie is I want to be the kind of man that if my daughters grow up to marry somebody like me, or if my son grows up to be somebody like me, that'll be something I'm proud of or happy of. That's the thing we should always aspire to. Now, if my kids, boys or girls, model every aspect of my personality, there will be things that I am very displeased about that because I'm not happy with myself and who I am and everything. But I try, and that's something we should all aspire to, not just for our family or our nieces and nephews and cousins, but also for all the people around us. We're there to show God's light, to be the salt among the world that makes the world palatable to God and interesting to God. And that's a cool privilege that we have, is to model God's will and God's relationship around us. And so I just wanted to take a bit and have everybody think about when you have and when you have not been successful in illustrating God to those around you. And just think about that for a minute. And then if anybody has anything you'd like to share with the group, we are streaming, so pick what you're what you want on the internet, but does anybody have anything they'd like to share about sometime when you felt you were successful modeling Christ, or when you tried and failed or didn't try?
I have a very difficult time showing the good part of that behind the wheel in traffic. There's too many times that I'm not showing the love of God.
Let me get in front of you. I need to get to the place 5 seconds faster than you.
Well, no, it's not always that. It's it's not using the language that I'm proud of when I see people do things that I've done and didn't like with them, but it was okay when I did it.
Turn signals.
George, I'm a professional driver as my job. I can have 50 people behind me, and I have to be careful that when ridiculous things happen in DC all the time, that I don't scream or say bad things. I just take it in stride, and it's something I have to, as a, be professional about it instead of flying off the handle where everybody could see.
It's not like you're in your own car, you can say
Right.
whatever you want. You have a
Yeah,
bunch
now
of
that's a
people that are
different
witnesses,
story.
Yeah, she's being recorded and has passengers
No
listening.
cameras allowed on our buses.
Oh, yeah, you're
No?
right. You don't get any cameras.
And they don't get it either because they're all so far back. They don't understand. They don't see what you see
Right.
up there.
Right.
The shades are down, and
Like I drive on the Beltway almost every day, and it just amazes me how many people will merge in and not use like blinkers or anything, just change lanes. I kind of have like a feeling, like an intuition that somebody's going to do it, and I just stay back, but they just do it all the time, back and forth, and the signal and stuff. And
Not
it's just
only,
dangerous.
not only do they not signal, but they move over like within inches of your front bumper.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
Well, I have a less aggressive driving style. Julie has a professional but more aggressive driving style than I do. And so I kind of experience a little bit of the different end of what she does. You know, I'm like, oh, okay, sure. Why don't you just pull ahead of me? That's fine. I'll let you go. That sort of thing. And then like 4 people try to all cram in that one little hole. I've in my job I've ended up driving more than I usually do over the last year and a half or two, so I have more opportunities to experience that moment, and I must say I haven't always shown a Christian outlook to everybody. But Julie and I for years, and this is funny, but it's also sad, we've always said, don't put a Christian sticker on the back of my car because it's not going to reflect well on Christ. I don't want that to go. Yeah, so we aspire to do. So that's a nice example that we can all relate to. Anybody else have anything you want to share?
I mean, not necessarily for me right now, but I guess like next door neighbor, you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. I don't know if it's that literal neighbor or people that you communicate with, but some neighbors I talk to, some neighbors I don't talk to at all. And it's like, I could go over there and be like, hey, here's some cupcakes or something, but I don't do that. I just kind of let them be who they are.
they wouldn't answer the door anyway.
But it's kind of like that. You're not supposed to prioritize neighbors. You're supposed to love all neighbors equally, but it's kind of like,
Yeah, how do you get in our modern world where we're all moving and we're all have so many things to do for our attention? How do we get active in the neighborhood and with our neighbors? I'm right there with you, probably considerably worse than you. I lived by next door neighbor for 2 years before I learned her name by reading the mail that I got
the wrong mail.
that was inadvertently delivered to me, and I still probably couldn't call her name if I saw her, but I've probably exchanged 15 words with my neighbor in the 3.5 years we've lived there now.
It's one of the things that I actually really liked during the pandemic was that we were all stuck at home, and so we would get together in like the cul-de-sac, be socially distanced and all those things. We spent more time with our neighbors and with our neighbors' kids during the pandemic than we have in the entire decade plus that we've lived at our house, because we don't have much in the way of extracurriculars, but everybody else's kid does 7,000 sports, and we never see them ever. And so it was nice to actually have time with our neighbors to hang out, to walk together for trick-or-treating or whatever it was. That was actually a really nice thing, and I feel of the things that we've lost after the pandemic, it's that reduction in busyness that I think afforded a lot better connections. I also miss the mandatory outdoor eating, but that's a different story.
Well, I find the most frequent place that I get to show Christ is at work. Now, just like most modern workplaces, if it's Christian theology, the workplace is not tolerant of you preaching or having a prayer service or anything like that. They can have something from another
Any
culture.
other religion.
They can have any other religion. Like my company for the last 2 years has had a Friday mindfulness event that you could join, and you could basically do Buddhist meditation. In that sort of thing. The person who led that left, and that's not there. That's not how our modern workplace supports. But there are so many places in work where you can treat people fairly. When somebody says, "What'd you do this weekend?" "Hey, we had this church event we went to." Whenever you're counseling somebody that you're a people leader to or a mentor to, and they're like, "Well, I could do this and I could do this," and you can pick the one that's the morally better choice. Well, maybe you could get more money like this, but you'd hate yourself in the morning, or you could do this and be proud of what you did.
On Facebook, I post I tag myself here and put the name of the sermon. I don't know why. Charlie's like, "How do you do that?" I'm like, I don't know, I just do. And as I become friends with people from work on Facebook, well, don't say that around Julie. Julie goes to church every Sunday. Watch out for Julie. Julie goes to church every Sunday.
Well, but it gives you opportunities. When you're dealing with, everybody deals with adversity in their work life. It gives you opportunities to express Christ's love and Christ's morality, and it gives you opportunities to go, "I did it this way last week, and I'm disappointed in myself for doing it that way." And I've had that's so hard to do. It's hard in a business situation to admit you did something you shouldn't have, and then fix it and make it right. And I've had a few cases where I've had an opportunity to do that. But you want, if you're representing Christ, you want your business partners to see you as someone who's diligent, someone who's responsible, someone who's moral, someone who can have their back and have trust, and that sort of thing. And you can push back on those sort of things when they come up. So that's a good way. Anything else anybody wanted to talk about that?
I was just gonna say that I like at my job. It's not a very religious job at all. Obviously, it's in the restaurant industry. But I'll tell people, I've got to go to church on Sunday or something like that, and I'll say it in passing. I won't keep on bringing it up to like nauseam, And I just have my work ethic and respectfulness towards others, and don't get angry, and just kind of keep that mentality through the whole day.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can kind of see that reflected, and then they could kind of like be an afterthought in their mind when they start thinking about it a little bit more about why that person is that way.
Yeah, it's important to think that, as a Christian in the workplace, you can get angry, you can do these things, but you need to do them with integrity. I can be angry at somebody. I assigned you to do this work, and you didn't do the work, and we lost $500,000 because you didn't do the work.
And you're fired.
And you're fired. We're gonna. I think you're gonna be. Let's say, I think you're gonna be more successful in another venue. I've thankfully not been in a position to need to fire anybody recently. But in my previous jobs, not in the job I'm in now, but in my previous jobs, I've had that duty. Hey, I'm going to have to cut you from the team, and here's why. But, in those kind of environments, even when you have bad news to deliver, or whenever you're angry because somebody didn't deliver, you can do it with integrity, and you can do it with honesty.
And you can, as we're told to do, say the truth in love.
Yeah, many years ago, I was in a case, well, many, not hundreds of years ago, but 30 years ago. I was in a situation where I had an employee that I felt was performing very well, but for various political reasons, the bosses said fire him. And they said, "Don't tell him anything." And I said, I can't do that. And they said, well, here's your choices. You can fire him,
We can
which is unfair, or we'll fire you and everybody that works for you. And so I had 25 people's
Lives in
livelihood in my hands. And so I sat down with the guy and I said, we're going to have to let you go. And he's like, why? Yeah. I'm like, because the bosses don't like you and they didn't give me an opportunity to do anything else, and I had to let you go. Now, there were more details to that were confidential things with the boss that I really couldn't tell him, but I wasn't going to just go, you're gone and we don't know why. And he left, and then he sued the company. And I think he ended up with about $50,000 out of the deal, which he deserved. That was just, how the thing worked. So, how do you deal with people with integrity and showing God's love? I would have loved to have been able to say, the bosses want you out, but we're not getting rid of you. But I didn't have the power to do that.
I think one of the things that I feel like I've been trying to, especially in my doc program, is that when I first applied and got waitlisted, and I asked for feedback, I was like, why did I get waitlisted? Because I know some of the other people that got in, and I'm like, and they said, well, we can tell you care deeply about your students, but we don't see evidence of social justice. And I'm like, what? And one of my faculty said, well, they clearly don't know you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more I thought about it, and I was like, okay, now I see what they're wanting. And I changed how I wrote one of my essays to get in, and took a either they'll like me or they don't. But the more I've been learning, and especially I think the study on Amos, that I had a very Fox News perspective on what social justice was.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't agree with it, but that was the perspective. And I'm like, that is not right. I should be seeking justice for my students. I should be, and the way I talk about what I do about knocking down barriers and giving my students a voice is an important part of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And that's social justice. And even more than that, as I'm learning, I'm like, the way in which I had to write my mission statement, and part of that was that treating everybody as an image bearer and not being afraid, as I've gotten to know my classmates, of talking about my faith, because we're actually all a really faithful bunch, which is nice to see. But now I'm like learning, it's encouraging me to learn more and be able to help people get outside the echo chamber of conservative media. Whatever you think of critical race theory, I promise you it is not what they tell you on the news. And I have the books to prove it. So, it's like I'm learning how to wind social justice around my faith, because that's what we're called to do. So.
That's a really interesting perspective. We've had that discussion in my work. The term social justice is kind of a politicized term. Everybody has their own definition of what it means there.
That's what I was thinking. What is her definition of social justice?
Yeah, and then that's what she was talking about. Is what if you just get your definitions from one side?
Source,
How does it do and stuff like
And
that?
that's the problem is then other people are using those words, and they're potentially meaning something different than what you think. And that's where it starts getting dangerous, because then you start presuming things about the person based on the language that they're using, but you're not speaking the same language. It's really difficult. I've kind of started to notice that if you see a politician use a phrase or take something and turn a phrase and start using it in a particular way, to always be suspicious of that because of that reason. Now, because if you see a politician doing it, now you have a phrase that means two separate things. It means however they mean it and however the opposing side to him means it.
It's always worthwhile, particularly with highly charged plastic mean thing, to drill down and understand what the other person really means. In my company, at an executive level, the executive team, we had one team pushing for social justice and equity and inclusion, and so there was some really good discussion about, well, what do you mean by that? We're an engineering company. And as an engineering company, if you do what some people define that as, where you get equal outcomes regardless of your performance, you blow up spacecraft. It doesn't work. If you go, oh, you get a gold star because you showed up, and you get a gold star because you did a good job. It ends up with an inequity in the reward situation. And so that was a very good discussion. We didn't solve everything, but we did focus, our company's diversity and inclusion on, getting real world results and on making sure people had equal opportunity. So a lot of people look at social justice and they want, equal outcomes. And so we want equal outcomes regardless of effort. And other people look at it and go, well, justice is everybody had the opportunity, and those who weren't successful. That's not really the topic of the lesson today, but that's an interesting discussion. And we have a lot of people on one side and a lot of people on the other side of that. And the reality of the situation is somewhere in the middle, but the rhetoric really can blow up and be hostile. In that particular
each side thinks they're right.
Everybody thinks they're right. Yeah. In that particular case that I was mentioning in my company, I was the one being skeptical, going, okay, what is this program supposed to deliver to the company? Are we going to use the company's money to sponsor a social movement that has nothing to do with the performance of the company, or are we going, what are we trying to achieve? And in my annual review, I was called out with a gold star for having, I'm known for my more conservative views in my company, but for being nice and discussing them, and for being eloquent and putting something together, and being collaborative and putting the team together. But we need to approach people and situations with compassion. So let's move on into Hosea. I had intended for us to spend a good bit of time on this slide and share our personal experiences. In fact, let me share a personal experience. For those of you who didn't come, I went to the memories service yesterday. It wasn't at all what I was expecting. I thought I was paying attention, and I thought I knew what it was going to be. And I thought it was going to be a case where people who had been in the church came in and explained I remember when we founded the church, and I remember when in the 60s when we had this problem and this thing, and I thought that maybe some people that were still living would be brought in to tell their story. I thought it was a push situation where the team had put together this and were sharing this cross-generational concept. And instead it was more of a collection. So it was more of a workshop where in a lot of different ways they ask, or in several different ways, they ask, what's your criticism of this church and what's your compliments for this church? And then different ways to try to prioritize those and so on. So it was more providing data to the system. It'll be interesting how they synthesize that and how they bring it back to us, because we wrote different things, compliments and criticisms, and people had little stickers to put on the one that was most important to them. So you could see the one with the most stickers is one that people were most concerned about when it was over. So there was a lot of data collection in that, and it was different than what I was expecting, but it was a worthwhile event, I thought. And so it'll be interesting to see how it comes out. And my point was just that I wanted to share that. Not that it fit particularly into that, but
we saw the setup on Thursday when we went in there. It looked really good.
yeah,
So.
it was different than what I expected, but it was I think valuable for collecting data and understanding where the church is going or should be going in the future and how God is calling us. So let's talk about Hosea. Hosea's ministry. I don't know if I spelled it right, but. Let me read this. This is not in the official reading for today, but this is the first verse of Hosea. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. So that's how it starts. The word of the Lord came to him during this period of time. Look at all those kings. So Hosea's ministry ran over more than 30 years until Israel's capital, Samaria, was taken by Sargon II of Assyria after a 3-year siege. So, it's easy to read. This is just a book. It's just a few verses, and it's about an event in Hosea's life. No, this book is about Hosea's life, decades of time that he spent, and there may be just a couple of verses talking about something that really is applying to decades or years of Hosea's life. And Hosea is kind of an amazing situation of how God chose to work through him, and it's hard to understand why God did it this way. We've already studied Amos. Amos was a prophet that was contemporary with Hosea. And as we'll get into what we're studying, God commanded Hosea and his family to be a living example of the faithless relationship Israel had with God. One thing we often lose track of with Israel, from a biblical perspective, and Sunday school perspective, reading what's in the Bible, we kind of think of Israel as this country that's established and running and doing all these things, and then there was a division. It's Israel and Judah, and that's all true. But through much of Israel's history, they were sort of like a captive country. They were paying tribute to somebody else. If you go look to somebody else's records, they consider Israel a province or part of their country, and they're not necessarily governing them directly. They're more like just saying, send us money every year. Or,
Client kingdoms.
yeah, client kingdoms. That's a good. My tongue wasn't finding that one. And there's layers of people coming and pulling things away from Israel, pulling people away from Israel. Hosea's ministry talks about how all these things are going to happen to Israel, and they're happening during Hosea's ministry. Over the last 15 or 20 years of his ministry, they were being attacked and some of their people taken away, and then they had nobody bothered them for a few years, and then there was more, and so on. So that's what they're now. This map that we've got here is focused on the people of Israel being taken away, who deported people from Israel, and there's the purple is one deportation from 734 to 732 BC, where people were grabbed from Israel and brought away to Nineveh, and then there was another deportation in 724 to 729 BC, and people were brought away here, and then there was a deportation by Sargon II, which shows them even going further east, so you can see that it was kind of a constant thing that the Israelites worried about, is who's going to attack us next and who are they going to take with them. And a lot of Hosea's life is talking about how, or is demonstrating, is modeling how Israel's behaved and how God is planning to respond to their behavior. So let's look at this next one. Would someone like to read the big words at the top, the Hosea verses 1, 2 through 3?
When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son.
What a terrible command from God. And I wonder sometimes, does God ever ask you to do something for the benefit of others that doesn't benefit you at all? This is the case. God is asking Hosea to do something for the benefit of this illustration. We're the beneficiaries of it because we get to read it, but the people at the time saw his life as a living example of what he was preaching, and it really wasn't good for Hosea.
The first clue was you marry somebody named Gomer.
Well, maybe Gomer was a good name. Then I didn't look up what Gomer means. Maybe Gomer means
It
It might have been
beautiful.
Gomer or something like that.
We're putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable for sure.
Or maybe our thinking that Gomer's a weird name is because nobody wants to name their kid Gomer after this.
Yeah, it's like Jezebel. There's not too many girls that are named Jezebel
No.
today.
Yeah, it's pretty. I've met one before, but it's
Yeah.
pretty rare.
Well, if you marry a promiscuous woman and have children, her children might be that too.
That's
Yeah,
true.
that's true, yeah.
And her children might not be your children.
Because their ethics are coming from her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you think about how heartbreaking it is, whether it's whichever spouse is the one that's unfaithful. And so this is not somebody who had too many drinks in a bar one night and went home with the wrong person. This is somebody who consistently was
It's a
promiscuous.
lifestyle.
Yeah,
Lifestyle.
it's a lifestyle. Probably a life. We don't know for sure, but probably a lifestyle and influenced by the fertility cults in the area. Some of the other verses talk about how Gomer really liked all the gifts that her lovers gave her. She was basically a prostitute of some level. Now she might have been more of a
Might have been
expect
like-
gifts.
I was gonna say it might be like if you frequent a regular bar or something on the weekends, you see the same woman there every weekend, and she's way too intoxicated going around to different people every time you see her.
Yeah, who can I
Something
go
like
home
that.
with tonight? Or
Right.
or you see a man doing the same
Same
thing.
thing, yeah, for a man.
Yeah,
too.
you know, who can I go? Our culture is kind of more approving of the guy than of the girl that does that, and it should not be approving of either.
Right.
The Amplified calls her a prostitute.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's and in other places later it becomes clear that she's a prostitute of some kind.
It should be noted, Gomer means to complete and is a rare name because it is a unisex biblical name.
To complete.
Means to
So well, I don't know. Well, that's good to know. Thanks for looking that
Yeah.
up. I mean,
love that kind of stuff.
it might be the name when you're like, I'm not having any more kids after this one. So you're complete. You're the last
Don't
one.
we all say that after we had a kid?
Yeah.
Certainly that
We
afternoon.
said that after Katie, and what, we had Charlie and Carrie?
Yeah, we chose to have more after that. Well, so, but the bottom line here is Hosea's, there's two things here. One is God has asked Hosea to dedicate his family. We're going to go over this more, a couple more slides here. Dedicate his family to modeling his heartbreak with Israel because Israel's faithless. You remember from some of our other studies, at this time, Israel has incorporated pagan practices like offering children into their worship of Yahweh, of God. They've worshipped other gods like Baal. They've conflated them together. They've done a lot of practices that God considered sexually immoral, of doing fertility cults, and church, as in the pagan church, sanctioned prostitution on Saturdays and stuff like that. They had all of these things, but even beyond that, they were, as we talked about in the other classes, they were, doing human trafficking. They were treating people without compassion. They were treating each other without compassion. It was a tough situation, and God was heartbroken. And he was so heartbroken that he said, Hosea, go model being heartbroken and go find a promiscuous woman and marry her, knowing she won't be faithful to you, knowing that that's going to disrupt your whole family life, so that you can demonstrate this to those around you. Now it went beyond Hosea and his wife Gomer. So even the children served. Somebody read this, the part Hosea 1, a little bit of 3, and then 4 and 5. How about you, Nate?
She conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel.
This is the one that I looked up. Jezreel means God sows. Not a bad moniker at first thought. However, Jezreel was an infamous valley where the 10th king, where a lot of things happened. There were some victories there, battles were held there, and there were some victories. I believe Saul and his son were killed there, so there were some defeats there. The Philistines were fought there. However, at this time, it was an infamous valley where the 10th king of Israel, Jehu, had all of the prior kings, and it was like 2 kings ahead of him, but the family, which Ahab was the patriarch of that family. King Ahab was a patriarch. He had all of the prior king's family hunted down and slaughtered, and they stacked up all their skulls in a big stack, and it was a lot. And so that big event of him just hunting down and killing the whole family of his predecessors to help secure his reign was an infamous event, and it was associated with bloody vengeance even 100 years later when Hosea's and Gomer's child was born.
This analogy, I guess, would be kind of like after the Civil War, if you named your child like Gettysburg or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Or
That would-
or Auschwitz.
yeah,
I'm gonna name my child Auschwitz.
yeah. Well,
So it was like that in their culture at the time, as far as we can tell. So it had meaning. So if you said, "Hi, my name's Jezreel," people were like, "Oh." So he named the child that Gomer had. We don't know that the child. I think if any of the children were fathered by Hosea, Jezreel is the most likely one to have been fathered by Hosea. But there's some other comments in some of the other verses that indicate maybe none of them were. So this is, even the children served as the situation. So think about all the neighbors. They're already talking. You know how neighbors talk. You know how, they're already talking. Hosea married Gomer. Why did he marry Gomer? He's out preaching to the masses, and she's over at Joe's house, David's house, or Jehoshaphat's house, or whoever's house it was. She's never home. She's not doing the things she's supposed to do. And then they had a kid, and they named him Jezreel. Did that make them pay attention to what Hosea was saying? Did that paint a picture that over the years of Hosea's life is coming clear, and then also in recorded, us looking back, helps us to understand the heartbreak. And also, God used. What about Jezreel? He was just a kid, and God used him. God visited on him the misfortune of having a bad name, and visited on him the misfortune of living in essentially a broken home to help strengthen Hosea's message to the Israelites and to us and the generations to come. Think about that whenever something goes really bad in your own life. We read about Job, where things that can happen bad in your life aren't necessarily God punishing you or saying you're bad. You may be participating in part of God's plan to get the message out.
That's where faith comes in. When hard times, bad things, set your sights on Jesus and follow him. And then at the end, when you can see the light at the end of the tunnel and you've gone through the experience, you have testimony to share with everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what God can make good come out of any situation.
I've said frequently that these are the lessons and the studies that need to happen. This is where you root yourself and you give yourself a base to operate from, so that when the storms do come, that you can stand up to them. These are the things that you fall back on. If you don't do these studies and you don't see this, then you have nothing during those times, and you can be blown here and there. And I've seen it. This is what you do when things are going well, is you take the time and you study this stuff.
It's so easy to go, oh, my God wouldn't do that. My God wouldn't punish a child by giving him a bad name when he didn't do anything wrong. God has a bigger picture.
Well,
He has a different purpose.
I was going to say, we can see what God's motivation is in the actions that are being taken here.
Mm-hmm.
God's motivation is His word and His message being proclaimed. That's the highest. That's where His goals are.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that we, I'll reflect that back on us, and even with Hosea, that we are supposed to be servants of that, and that Christ proclaimed is our goal.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes bad things happen in order that Christ be proclaimed. There's a big book of martyrs where it didn't pan out well for them physically,
Mm-hmm.
but the rewards that they have in eternity are great.
Yeah, and sometimes things seem really, really bad, and then when you look at it from a spiritual perspective, or when we see it from a spiritual perspective, when we're on that golden shore someday, we'll go, that's why that happened. That was the good that came out of that.
And we don't always have to wait until we're on that shore someday.
Well, that's why we're having this class. Hopefully we can
In
understand
my
it.
life, things were downhill financially for 3 years, but that disaster in my life is what brought me to God,
Mm-hmm.
what brought me to faith in Jesus.
So,
Without that, who knows where I would
Yeah, you wouldn't give up those bad times now,
Right.
because it had such a great output.
so if Hosea is going out and trying to speak the word of God and have people listen and take him serious, is his wife weakening what he's saying by what she's doing? Is it like somebody in the church and their kids are doing bad things, and
In this particular case, his wife Gomer and his children are his visual aids. He's saying to the people,
This is what you're doing to me.
Israel's faithless. Look, and it's not the comedian, take my wife please. It's like, look at my life. That's, see how you're upset or how you're sad for my life is terrible. That's how you're treating God. And so they are, God created this on purpose as a visual aid, or as an example for Hosea to use in his preaching, to try to convince the Israelites that they were faithless in their relationship with God. And they're like, no, we worship Yahweh, and on Saturday, and on the other days we worship the other gods, and and everybody just goes along to get along, whatever it is they were doing. And Hosea's there going, no, look at my life. I have an unfaithful wife. I have kids that I've named after calamities. Doesn't this look sad? Or you feel sorry for me? Oh yeah, that's terrible. You're
Now
even
imagine
worse.
how God feels.
Now imagine what God feels about you,
I mean, that's the
because
epitome
you're
of this
worse
book.
than her.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
So it just goes on and on, and they still served. Could somebody read this Hosea 1:6-7?
Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, "Call her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved, for I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but I, the Lord, their God, will save them."
Who can name their kid not loved
Yeah.
or unloved. This is a big ask that God is asking Hosea, and I guess Gomer didn't have a say in it, to name his kid. It's a big ask that God is asking of this innocent baby to wear this name, to illustrate the point. God was using Hosea's life and the life of his family to show how Israel's faithlessness was driving their relationship down. Yeah, I don't know exactly why. It's kind of an interesting little aside. Yeah, I'll show love to Judah and I'll save them. And that actually refers to an event where Judah was attacked. All of the major cities were taken in Judah except for Jerusalem. And there was a siege and they were inside Jerusalem for a long time. And then God himself went out and slew 180 something thousand of the enemy, and the enemy left. And so that's a different story that's not in Hosea. But that's what it's referring to there is that, okay, I'm going to save Judah. And this is also accounted for in some of the other countries around them. They say it different ways. The Jewish or the Hebrew documentation is like they couldn't beat us because look how they were defeated at Jerusalem, and the surrounding kingdoms documentation is we took them all, but we didn't take Jerusalem because who wants that? But so it's reported, and you can go to the Bible Museum and there's a stone there that has the story written from I think Assyria's point of view or something. It's very interesting. But the thing is, just God did it again. Just naming your kid after an infamous event is not enough. Now name your kid, your daughter, unloved. And so it's continuing to show, this is heartbreaking. And it went on. Wendy, can you read the Hosea chapter 1, 8 through 9 there?
After she had weaned Lo-Hama,
Lo-Ruhama, I guess.
Hard word.
Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, call him Lo-Ama, which means not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Wow.
With this child, God is modeling in Hosea's ministry that he's rejecting Israel. He's given up on Israel. So Hosea is all this time been saying, repent, you're separating yourself from God, you have a bad relationship, look at my life, it's an illustration of how bad yours is even worse, and they're not listening. And so with this child, God's saying, you're not my people anymore. I'm rejecting you. I'm going to reject Israel. Also, it's probably highly likely that the child was obviously not Hosea's son. So that probably figured into it as well. There's a place later where it says that all of Hosea's children were the product of promiscuity. Or that's one way to interpret it. And so scholars debate were all of his kids his biological kids or not. It doesn't really matter.
I wonder if it's kind of like a double entendre where it's it's not his son anyway, so
Yeah.
he named him not mine.
Yeah, you're not my people.
Right.
And Hosea's children, likely fathered by Gomer's adulterous lovers, were a living message of the broken relationship Israel had with God. Israel was so unfaithful that God did not even want them for his people anymore. So, now, we're not going to read chapter 2, but I invite you to read chapter 2 on your own after this class. It's a pretty harsh chapter. It tells the tale of Hosea turning out Gomer. Just like Hosea prophesies that God is going to turn out Israel. And it's got things in there where Hosea is speaking to his kids and saying, basically, let's see, to paraphrase, your mother sucks. Don't honor your mother. I'm throwing her out.
Yeah, don't feel sorry for her.
Yeah, and I'm going to expose her to everybody. So there's and God asked Hosea to do this, and so he says throw her out. So he's still illustrating with his family how God is going to throw Israel out. And then, about halfway through chapter 2, it tells the tale of God relenting and making plans to bring Israel back into his love again. So it's very harsh. It's get out, get out, get out. I'm going to take all your clothes. I'm going to just send you out naked in the world. Don't have anything to do with you, and I'm going to tell your children that you're worthless. And then in the end, which is not any way you should ever act towards a spouse. Except, in this case, God is using them to illustrate the situation. And then he talks about how, but I'm going to bring you back in.
Yeah, and how he actually goes and pays and buys Gomer back.
Yes. That's the next thing. So next we're going to talk about restoration. So could you read the verses 1 through 4 of Hosea? So we're going to jump to Hosea 3. Hosea 3 is a really short chapter, and it talks about the final restoration.
The Lord said to me, "Go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites. Though they may turn to other gods and love the sacrifice raisin cakes, so I brought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a, what's that?
Lethek?
Of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way towards you."
Did she agree?
She did. So she was living with one of her lovers.
Yeah.
At this time, and he went to her, and the commentators make a lot of speculation. She may have been a prostitute and she was living with her pimp. And Hosea goes, "I want her back." And he goes, "She's making me money.
Yeah, this is what it's going to
You
cost
got to buy her back."
Yeah.
One of the other commentators says, "Well, I bought her with 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley." One of the commentators speculated that she cost more than 15 shekels of silver, but that's all that Hosea had. And so he had to scrape together some of his stuff and say, well, here, let me sweeten the deal with some stuff to buy her back. And then, see, in the end, he said, okay, well, you're going to live with me many days, and you're not going to be a prostitute, and you're not going to be intimate with any man, and I'm not going to be intimate with you. For a long period of time, there was nothing going, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But God had Hosea model restoration with Gomer, leaving some hope for the Israelites to be restored to God. Now, at this stage, the Israelites have rejected Hosea's 30 plus years of ministry, and the Israel, maybe some anecdotally people understood and were repented, but as a nation, they haven't heard and accepted what Hosea said, and they haven't repented. He's been unsuccessful in his ministry.
They ignored the message.
Yeah, they've ignored the message, and so, but God is still using Hosea and his life to model the restoration hope that he holds out for Israel. So, let's talk about the restoration to come. So who would like to read Hosea 3, 4 through 5?
For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in those last days.
Ever heard that in the last days? Ever heard that phrase in the New Testament? The the days between Israel being taken off by the Assyrians and Jesus' birth are the many days. So that's what this is. If you think, the Old Testament ends and there aren't spectacular divine revelations to the Jewish people, and also the Israelites got taken off. Now they didn't take every single Israelite. They took all of the higher end of society. All of the movers and shakers and money makers and the princes and nobles and all that. Those are who they took, and they took off to Assyria. And then anybody else that looked able-bodied enough to be a worthwhile slave, and they left remnants behind. We don't know what percentage. Does that mean they left 80% of the populace behind and took 20, or we don't know what the percentages are, or I don't. Maybe some historian knows a little more. But during that time, Israel lost its religious practice, and they didn't have the sacred stones. They didn't have a sacrifice on a sacred altar. They didn't have the robes that they wore, and they're not going to have any of that stuff because they got all taken off. And then for I think it's around 400 years, there really wasn't. They didn't hear from God. And then Christ was born. And so this in Hosea is a prophecy of Jesus to come. And David, their king, so they're going to come back to David, their king, is Jesus coming to establish his heavenly kingdom. So that's the king that they're going to get back. You can look, and there's little bits of back and forth in history and stuff like that. I believe, and I can't remember the name, I'm sorry, but I believe the last king of Israel was assassinated in the valley of Jezreel. That was where their military might was broken, where their bow was broken. It's a metaphorical speech for that I talked about earlier. And Israel's existence as a power was destroyed. And they're all carted off. And the next time that God brought them back and restored them to him was with Jesus. He didn't bring them back as a people, as a nation. He brought them back by, through Jesus' gospel, the gospel of Jesus. And there's a couple of things I'd like to read. Now, I don't have them in my slide deck. So if anybody has, Josh, could you do Acts 13, 22 through 23? And Kathia, could you do Revelations 5 and 5? And George, could you do Revelations 22 and 16? Because these were some of the verses offered up demonstrating where in the New Testament it refers back to Hosea, and there's different uses of words and stuff that people are confident that they're referring back to Hosea and identifying Christ as David, or the root of David, as this king that's coming.
Okay. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will. Of this man's offspring, God had brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as he promised.
And that's the most explicit statement of Christ, is the David that Hosea is talking about, that I found in the readings.
I wept and wept and wept that no one was found able to open the scroll and able to read it. One of the elders said, Don't weep. Look, the Lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David's tree, has conquered. He can open the scroll, can rip through the 7 seals.
Awesome. And George.
22:16. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you and to give you assurance of these things for the churches. I am the root, the source of life, the offspring of David, the radiant and bright morning star.
So, and actually our book, the teacher's book, gave a couple more verses, which I read, and they didn't seem to be talking about that so much. So I didn't pick those, but I picked these because they seem to be directly speaking. Maybe if I'd drilled deeper into the textual similarities between Hosea, maybe I would have understood why they recommended those other ones. But these, clearly to me, seem to say that. So I'd like to wrap up with some thoughts for discussion. And we're right pretty much exactly on time, 1 hour after we started. So think about this. We're out of time, so we don't have a big discussion planned. But just think about this from Job. So we know from Job that calamity in life isn't always about us. Our role is to glorify God wherever his plan takes. And think about Hosea with these things that God asked him to do with his family to create this family and the children, and the children had to bear up under it as well. That was for God's purpose, not because Hosea was bad or the children were bad. And then from the prophets, we know from numerous Old Testament prophets that God sometimes punishes with hardships, just as Hosea was forecasting. Israel's destroyed their relationship with God, and they're going to be punished in hopes of, and the key thing, it's in hopes of bringing us back to him. It's hard to differentiate. Is this bad thing happening to me today because it's part of God's greater plan? Or is it happening to me today because I'm being punished because I went off book from God's plan last year? And we don't always know, but it's clear that both situations can happen. So anytime something bad happens to you or something bad happens to somebody else, don't go, oh, God's punishing them, unless God told you, because you don't know. And similarly, when something bad happens to you, don't have that attitude, or if something bad happens to you, don't always assume it's because God hates you. It maybe God is working some wondrous thing in you, and you just have to, strengthen up under.
God will never hate you. He'll discipline you, but he won't hate you.
Right. So then, what about Hosea? What do you think about God using Hosea's whole life, his marriage, and his children to illustrate his point? And the thing I wanted to think about with that I didn't really write in here, but I wanted to bring up, I think mentioned in the sermon today, Christ praying, let this cup pass from me. Christ is a sacrifice for us. There's a lot of different layers to Christ's sacrifice and atonement for us. But one of them that resonates with me is, what if God had changed his plan? And what if God had instructed Jesus to hold a convocation of all of the religious leaders, and they would write a big document like the religious Magna Carta and say, here's how religion is, and they did that instead of Christ being sacrificed. If that's what they'd done, you wouldn't listen. The fact that Christ died, you can look at it from the perspective of propitiating, covering our sins, the forgiveness of our sins. But one way that I like to look at it is Christ died because if he'd done anything else, we wouldn't have paid attention. Now he'd be just a blip in history. Or,
Even dying for us, there are many that don't pay attention.
God, Hosea did his whole life as an illustration for God. Christ did his whole life as an illustration for God and God's reconciliation to us, and the end of the story of Hosea. And so that's what I wanted to bring up with that point. So thank you for paying attention to our live stream, and thank you guys for coming. And then if Kathia, you could close us in prayer. Let me turn off the streaming first.